I want to talk about something that is only slightly less fun, but certainly just as terrifying as roller coasters. Gantt charts. So if you don't know what a Gantt chart is, just to make sure we're all on the same page, a Gantt chart shows the start and the finish date of a project or of a portion of a project. And a very simple Gantt chart might look something like this, right, where you can see where the strategy portion of a project may start and finish, and then a design portion of a project, and then a development portion of a project. And when we think about this, I mean, this is a chart, right? That's part of the name. So when we think about this chart, most charts have x-axis and y-axis. And the x-axis is pretty easy, right? The x-axis on a Gantt chart is usually time. I think we all probably could guess that. But we never really talk about what the y-axis is. Anybody have any guesses? What's the y-axis on a Gantt chart? Skill? OK. That's a good guess. What else? Items, deliverables, totally. I mean, it could be those. What I've found, unfortunately, on projects, even though we don't like to admit it, sometimes the y-axis really stands for importance. Right? Think about the projects that you've been on. The UXer or the information architect or whatever you want to lump into strategy, that person is usually the most important. Right? They don't start until all the stakeholders are present. They lead project definition. They got to get everybody in the same room. All the stakeholders have to be there and bought in. Designer, a little bit less so. As always, developers get the short end of the stick. Sometimes they don't even know what project they're on. Right? It's like requirements are half-baked. This is a bit backwards, though, right? If you think about it, when you make a website, who is the one person that you actually need to make a website? It's the developer. It's the person who can write the code, who can specifically write the HTML. So if we think about this in terms of importance, it's actually flipped. It should be a little bit more like that. Right? That's a little bit more accurate. But that's a bit of a weird Gantt chart. So instead of importance, maybe let's redesign this chart a little bit. If you look at the y-axis there, instead of importance, maybe we can think about this as effort. Right? And if we think of it as effort, we have to redraw the chart a little bit. And maybe it looks a little bit more like this. It's more accurate, where people's effort across a project will wax and wane. Right? So some people ramp up, some people ramp down. Usually at the start of the project, the strategist says kind of high involvement, high effort. And it's a little bit like a roller coaster track, right? A little bit like kind of the track we've seen. Now, these would be boring roller coasters. If you think about the strategist, it's like, all right, it's like you go to the top of the thing, you start, and then you just go down, and that's it. Kind of sucks to stand in line the whole time. For designer, it's a pretty good ride, right? You start at the bottom, you get the steady climb, and then a nice drop, but again, kind of boring. Of course, developers get the short end of the stick again. Steady climb to the top. Sorry, ride's over. If you think about your time at theme parks, at least for me at least, I don't go to theme parks to ride separate roller coasters from my friends, right? We don't go together and all right, you ride that one, I ride that one, you ride the other one. Right? It's a shared experience. We want to ride this track together. Right? That's part of the fun of being there. And if you think about a project, sometimes some of us have even said, wow, that project was a roller coaster, huh? Right? We want to ride that roller coaster together so we can have the same experience. So this is not a great shape for a project if you think about the shape of a project. Well, what is a better shape? Well, we've seen them before. And sometimes they look like this. Right? So this is on the top, if you're familiar with, if you're a coder and you use GitHub or something like it. This is the code that's been committed to a repository, kind of visualized over time. And one of the things that I strive for on the projects that my agency works on is to have a roller coaster ride, a shape of a roller coaster track that everybody can experience. So of course, if you look at the graphs there, sure, the tech director and the lead engineer, yeah, they're committing the most code to this repo. But what I try to strive for is if you look at the other three boxes, the product director was also writing code. Certainly not as much as the engineers or the tech director. But the creative director and the art director are also committing code to this repository. Right? The reason for that is if you aggregate those graphs, you get the graph up top, and we've all been part of the same experience. We've all been part of the same roller coaster ride. Now, this might be a change in process for a lot of you. Right? A lot of you may work at places, or maybe you're working by yourself, where this isn't possible or this doesn't happen. So I want to give you a couple of tips and tricks to maybe make that a little bit more possible, or at least move toward that. So if we have time at the end of the talk, we'll do a Q&A session. And some of the things you might be wanting to think about during this talk are, what should you work on if you're a designer, right, in 2018 with responsive design and CSS Grid and GitHub and designers coding and coders designing? What is your job? Like, what should you be working on? What about being agile, right? Agile is usually for software development teams. If you're a designer or a UX person, how do you fit into an agile process? And what about your growth as a professional? Right? What does that actually look like? What should you be doing? What should you be learning, especially if you've been doing this for a long time? So maybe those are some things to kind of think about, and if we have time, we'll talk about them at the end. This is the Nike Tailwind. I'm a big Nike fan. In 1978, they introduced this shoe, and it was a big shoe for them. It was a big launch. They did a massive ad campaign to release this shoe. In this shoe was 12 new product innovations. Right? It was really hyped heavily, did big splashy ad campaigns, and customers were buying this shoe. Everywhere they sold this shoe, they would sell out. But just as fast as the shoe sold out, the shoe was also being returned to the stores. And what customers were complaining about was one innovation in particular, which is what Nike did is they reinforced this shoe, at the time was a revolutionary concept, is they put aluminum in the shoe to reinforce it to make it stronger. Unfortunately, those aluminum particles were actually shredding the fabric, acting like microscopic razors, so when you run, the top of your feet were getting sliced up. Not a great experience. In his memoir, Phil Knight, who's the CEO of Nike, he wrote a memoir called Shoe Dog, and he said about the Tailwind, "We learned a valuable lesson. Don't put 12 innovations into one shoe. It asks too much of the shoe, to say nothing of the design team. We reminded each other that there was honor in saying back to the drawing board." This is a site called Nike Better World. Does anybody remember this site when it was launched? It was launched in about 2011. And it's certainly more commonplace now, this parallax kind of thing. But this is one of the first sites that really popularized the parallax idea. It was created by my friend Ian Coyle. He's a designer, developer, hybrid in Portland. He's run a few agencies. He runs one now called Enjoy the Weather. And the guy's just a wizard. I was blown away by this site when I first saw it. I was like, man, so I called Ian. Ian, how did you make this site? How did you come up with this idea? He's like, well, it's kind of like fiddling around in the web inspector, just changing some things, trying to design in the browser a little bit. And I just kind of came across this effect by accident. But once I saw it, I was like, oh, that could be really cool. And he's like, and I spent all of the time on the project just trying to perfect that effect. Right? I just spent every minute of the project just on that effect, getting it right, getting it buttery smooth, making sure there was no jank and there was no chug, and none of it. And he said, and everything else, because of that, I just left plain. Because if you make everything on the site special, then nothing is special. Right? And that quote just really stuck with me, that as designers, what we try to do is we try to trick it all out, right? Like everything has to be animating and whiz-bang and just amazing. And let's take a look at this, right? So if you look at the screen grab from this site, even in 2011, this is a fairly standard pattern, right? Text on the left, image on the right. There's nothing really special about the layout here, or even the design. It's a nice typeface, sure. It's just a picture next to it. Right? We've seen variations of this. Text on the right, image on the left. Right? But it's still plain. And I think as designers, we're notorious for trying to just pack 12 innovations into one shoe. And we don't need to be doing that stuff. Right? So let's talk a little bit about design process. Let's say we were designing Mashable. What most designers would do, I'm certainly guilty of this, is we design like we read. Top to bottom, left to right. So what we do is we start with the logo. Then we design the nav. Then we design the main column and the sub-column, and that is just a waste of time. All of that is a waste of time, right? We do our grids, we do our point sizes, we do fine-tuning of spacing, and round one of the first comp, and that's just a waste. And the reason it's a waste is because any developer worth their salt can set those things up in minutes with the conversation, right? I would sit next to a developer, hey, let's build an article page. I think it should have a title and probably a main column and a sub-column and a header. You want to start with those things, right? And I'll spin those up really quickly. It's not going to look great yet, but it doesn't need to look great yet. As designers, what we should be focusing on is really what's the one thing that makes it special. For Nike Better World, it was the parallax effect. For a site like Mashable, it's going to keep your eye on see the little graph above the picture? Right? That was one of the standout things on this version of Mashable's redesign was this velocity graph. That's part of the thing that made this thing special. All the rest is vanilla. All the rest is it's an article, right? An article is an article is an article. Title, share widgets, number of people who've read it, image, text, main column, side column. That thing is unique. That's the thing that we should be spending most of our time on. What is the thing that you're just really love to do, really want to do, you can't wait to get it out of your head, right? What's the thing that's going to be your organization's competitive advantage? Like those are the things that we should be focusing our time on. So how do you figure out what are those things, right? You're working on a redesign or you're working on a new feature of your product. How do you figure that out? Well, Jason talked about it this morning too, but urgency is a really good way to figure out what's important, right? So I see urgency as one of my main drivers for what to focus on next. Whatever's the most urgent, that's the thing that I do next. So it's not, Jason talked about urgency as a way to prioritize your day, and it's no different for a feature, or for an addition, or for a redesign. So there's three things to me that kind of drive urgency. So the first thing is, if you work on an existing product or an existing site, what's most urgent is to fix the stuff that's broken, right? Anything that's buggy, anything that's broken. Sure, I think we all know that. Let's move past that. The next thing is, maybe a little bit less common, heavily requested features. So what are the things that your users are asking for, or your stakeholders are asking for, or just really needs to be there? Like, that might be the next most urgent thing. And then the third thing, this is the one where we often skip. And this is the one where I think we should spend the most of our time, is excitement. What are you excited about? You are a professional. Your boss hired you because you're really good. What's the thing that you have an instinct about that's going to make this site shine? What idea is clawing its way out of your head? You just can't wait to get it into pixels. Like, for me, when I work, I get the best out of the people that I work with by asking them, like, I don't know, what would you do right now? Well, I would really spend time on that velocity graph. It's killer. Well, cool, let's spend a cycle on that. Right? And I find that I'm going to get the best work out of them because they're excited to do it. And they'll do it faster than something that they don't want to do. And when you work with really good people, which I imagine a lot of you do, they're probably going to have really good ideas that are worth following and worth pursuing. I'll tell you a couple of examples of that. You probably haven't heard of this company before, Dotdash. My agency did some work with them about 2 years ago. But it's the new name for a company that's been around since 1997. Has anybody heard of Dotdash before? Probably not too many. How about About.com? Has anybody heard of About.com? So Dotdash is the new name for About.com, and they've been around since 1997. And chances are probably most of you have been to About.com, but you probably can't place when or where or what you found there. And that was kind of the problem, right? It's like it was a content portal. It's high-ranking content. You go to the site. You read about what you want to, right? How to change a tire. You go to the site. The site just kind of looks like internet. You know what I mean? Like, and then you leave. And they know this. This is the CEO, Neil Vogel. And he says, like, nobody cares about a general information site anymore. You can't have a symptoms of colitis content on the same domain that you have how to unclog my drain, how to cook beer battered chicken, how to fix my tendinitis. And that's kind of what the site was, right? It's just kind of this catch-all. And so what we did was, when we worked with them, was they had all these kind of subdirectories and sections of their site, health and tech and money and home. And what we helped them do was we helped them spin out all of these into separate sites, into separate verticals. Right? So about.com/health became a site called Verywell. So if you go to verywell.com, you'll see all their health content in one place, a separate site. Or their site about tech became LifeWire, their site about money became The Balance, and the Spruce was about their home and lifestyle content. And we did all of these, everything from naming the new brand, doing the identity work, design, development, building new custom CMSs for all of them in 3 months each. Now, I don't know what your cycles are like, but that was really fast for us. It was really aggressive. So let me tell you a little bit about how we did that. And really, the way that we did that was focusing on what was most urgent. Right? So we collected everybody in the room, right? Everybody who was going to be working on it, product managers, designers, QA people, engineers, content people, video team, everybody. And we had a short brainstorm, probably about an hour, with this driving question. What is going to make this site special? Right? That was the topic of the moment. And after a short discussion, we had a list, right, that we just wrote down on these flip charts. And then we divided people into groups. And so we had a bunch of tables, and each table had a particular focus. So one table was focused just around image galleries, right? So there was a couple of people that were like, man, we think image galleries on this site are going to be amazing. Like, we have really good ideas for that. Another table tackled video. They're like, we just have great ideas for video. Another one did e-commerce integration. Another did advanced search. Or you get the idea. Kind of broke everybody into groups. And each of these groups were multidisciplinary. So there were some engineers at a table, some designers at a table, some product managers at a table. And we just did a little like hackathon for half a day, where all these multidisciplinary teams could just work on and kind of brainstorm a topic like the ones at their table and just see what they could do with it. And then at the end of that day, we had a little show and tell demo day. This is Dan. He's an engineer that works there. And he was on the video table. He was at the video table. And he showed a little code pen that they did where, as you're watching a video, at certain cue points, it would trigger scroll down the page to kind of get you to the next step. Right? So it's kind of this like follow-along video. kind of cool. We're not sure if it was going to do anything or mean anything or if we're going to integrate it, but a good proof of concept that just kind of got the wheels turning for everybody else. This is Rob. He's a design director there. And he was screen sharing his Illustrator and Photoshop canvases to show how to best visualize the difference between articles on the site and image galleries, because he wanted to make sure that people could go, I just want to look at a bunch of images, let's say for the home and lifestyle site, right? So how can people actually identify those visually? And what Rob started to do was a thing called, that I like to call an element collage. And I like working with element collages because I think they encourage designers to explore ideas really quickly and urgently, but in a format that's unencumbered, right? So it's an element collage, I'll show you an example, or a couple examples. They're not as complete as full-page designs, but they're also not as abstract as a mood board, right? They're like squarely in the middle. And so let me give you some guidelines for element collage, and I'll show you some examples. So when I'm designing an element collage, whatever app I'm using, Photoshop, Illustrator, Sketch, InVision, I'll create a big canvas, right? So don't use an artboard size. You know, in Photoshop, I'll do like 2,000 by 2,000, or in Sketch, I'll do the infinite artboard, right? Not a particular artboard size. And the reason is because I think content and ideas should inform the canvas size, not the other way around. So no need to introduce this artificial constraint too early. The next thing I'll do is I'll create many sizes of elements. So, for example, I'll make a footer that's 1123 wide, and then I'll make a mortgage calculator that's 317 pixels wide. And the reason for that is because it'll keep you on track for visualizing all of the elements at different sizes, right? And make sure you keep your design language intact. And then the third thing, kind of similar to the urgency thing, is just have fun, right? How many of us work at places where we're like, well, I'm just following the brand standard. You know, I don't get to design anything fun. This is your opportunity, right? This is where you can just explore something. And if it doesn't work out, that's fine. But at least you got to do it, right? So this is a place where you can have fun. So other than that, it can kind of look however you want. It's any format. So let me show you some examples. This is an element collage that we did for a company called Radio Free Europe. It's a news organization. And so one of the things that we knew was going to be important on the site was typography. We spent a lot of time kind of thinking about the typography and type relationships and how they would work together. We also knew that it was going to be kind of a suite of sites. So they had sites that were published in Spanish, or published in Arabic, or published in multiple languages. So how could we create kind of a color palette that worked consistently across, while each of them had their own voice? One of my favorites is, see this battleground Ukraine thing. This was a component that they use a lot, and a lot of us have components like this on our own sites, and no one really knows what to call that, right? Some people call it a slider, some people call it a carousel. It's not really either of those. Anybody have a good name for that? Well, Radio Free Europe called it Fred. So one of the things that we tried to do in our element collage was like, let's just play around with Fred and see what we can do with Fred. That sounds really creepy out of context, so can you edit that part out of the video? This is another element collage, completely separate. This is for a small private school right outside of Pittsburgh called Seton Hill University. Not Seton Hall, Seton Hill University. And one of the things that I loved about this project was the staff there and the team that we were working with made the really difficult decision. Some of you that work at higher ed, or maybe have worked with higher ed companies, know that a higher ed site is generally a mishmash, right? It's like, well, it's got to be for prospective students and current students and alumni and, the community and the faculty and the staff, and it just becomes a site for nobody, right? They made a really difficult decision, which I think was great, which was that our site is just going to be for prospective students, incoming freshmen, undergrad. And that let us take a really strong direction a really strong take on art direction, on concept, on content strategy. And so exploring that in the element collage, we're exploring ideas in architecture. We're exploring even the visual look. Like, what if the whole site kind of looked like Instagram? Would that be appealing to incoming freshmen, right? And who knows if that idea is good yet, but that's okay. That's what we're trying to explore through an element collage. And sometimes it's hard to write a strategy on paper to say, let's make the site look like Instagram, right? Because you're like, I don't know, I guess that would be good. It's another thing to actually see it, right? Abby talked about that earlier. You got to visualize that, right? The thing that exists in people's head, the monster in their head, how do you actually visualize that? How do you put that in front of people so they can look at it and go, oh, no, that's totally not the right direction? Right? That's good feedback to get that, but it's hard to get that without visualizing that thing. I'll show you another example, same client, right? This is another element collage for the same company. And you see how you can explore the ranges there. You can explore different type relationships, or different image treatments, or different ways to visualize content. And as a designer, honestly, it's just fun. It's just fun to make. I don't always get to make stuff like this, so it's a good opportunity to do that. To go back to some of the .dash and about.com stuff, for very well, that was their health content. And we knew on that site, typography was going to have to do a lot of the hard work, a lot of the heavy lifting to strike the right tone, because often, very well, and sites like it, sites like WebMD, they're often the first place that somebody goes when they find out that they or a loved one have a terminal illness, right? So it couldn't be super playful, but also didn't need to be sterile. It actually needed to have, I guess, good bedside manner. So the art direction had to be professional and courteous to the reader. It couldn't be too bubbly, right, as you see kind of on the right side of that scale, but it couldn't be too rigid either. So what's the right tone that we could strike there? And then once we found the right tone in the typography, how could that influence things like the mark or the brand or the identity, and even to the image treatment, right? So maybe we round some of the corners but keep one of them sharp. Maybe that was a theme that we kind of carry through on the site. And again, at this stage, you don't know which one of those ideas are going to pan out, but at least this is the time to explore those. Along with this element collage, we worked with the data science team, and what we found was, they have a great data science team there, what we found was within health content, people tend to explore everything around a topic, right? If you find out you have leukemia, you want to read everything you can about leukemia. So what we wanted to do was create these sort of chapter experiences so that if you were in the, say, arthritis section of the site, you knew that you were there through the branding, through the illustration, through the theme. So it's almost like creating these little subsections of the site and reinforcing to you from a wayfinding perspective, you're in the right place, here's a place to learn more about that particular thing. So everything from allergies to pregnancy to nutrition to all of those things, we did all these custom illustrations for that particular area of the site. Now for the balance, right, the same company, it's all about.com, but the art direction, the theme, all of that was very different. The balance was about finance, and the goal for that site was, how do we demystify money so that everybody can understand it? Right, so in our research, we found these amazing old Pelican book designs. Look how beautiful they are. They're so great. And they just strike the right tone of iconic imagery that's really simple, but it boils complex concepts down to just their visual essence. So one of the things that we explored in our element collage was, how do we take that and actually modernize, bless you, how do you take that and modernize that and actually make it appropriate to a new site? Right, so this is our take on it is, maybe we did something a little bit more like that. Right? So again, kind of same idea, maybe it's custom illustrations per section, but very different style. And the element collage was the right place for us to explore that. Doing comps was a little bit too far because we weren't sure about the content yet. Right? This is not like a strategy document or anything like that, or an IA document. It's really kind of the visual design version of that. And doing this influenced the site's color palette and overall identity and typography and things like that. So those are just a few ways that I think designers can start to break down their process. Right? If you think about what engineers and developers do, they're really good at working on small chunks. Right? That's why Agile works really well, is breaking down the small chunks. As designers, we don't often do that as much. We don't know how to do that. We design full comps, right? A full page, full screen. Doing an element collage helps you break things down into little elements. I think it's timely with the way that we are all as an industry starting to design now, with designing components or designing atomic or like all of those kinds of words. So, an artifact like this lends itself to maybe that kind of process. Okay, so of course, there's a more direct way too, right? Which is you just jump in the code. If you want to work like an engineer, work like an engineer. Every so often, Twitter erupts in this should designers code debate, right? Of course, I'm sure you've all seen this. All right, so the question of the hour, should designers code? I think there's an easy answer to this. The answer is not that John Maeda said so in Wired magazine, although that's a pretty compelling reason, I must admit. The answer is not, as Val was talking about this morning, the famous non-answer, it depends. I think we could do a little bit better than that. I think the answer is yes. I think the answer is that, yeah, designers should code. And to make it more clear, the question is not really should designers code. It's a little bit more abstract than that. It's should designers learn a thing that makes them better? And the answer is yes. But there's a second part to this, too, that we often leave out. Is it going to be OK if they don't? Yeah. If you want to learn to code, great. Do you have to? No. Should you? Yeah. So let's say you're one of the designers that you're like, cool, sign me up, I'm ready to code. I don't know anything about code, but I'm down to do it. I've been wanting to do it for a long time. But maybe you don't know where to start. I have some tips. And if you're not a designer, but you're a developer, maybe you work with somebody. You work with a designer that's like, I would love to learn to code. And you're like, I would love to teach you, but I don't know how to teach you how to do that. I have some tips for you, too. Right? This works both ways. 3 things that I think a designer can learn to introduce them to code. The first thing is CSS, but not all of it. Right? CSS is really powerful. There's a lot of it. So just start with fonts and colors. I'll teach it to you right now if you don't know it. So don't worry about layouts. Don't worry about responsive. Leave all that stuff to your engineers and to your developers. Right? It is just learn font sizes and colors. So to change the font size of something, you write font dash size, and then you write the size, and then the units, and that's it. I'm not blowing any minds here. That guy's like, I'm out of here. All right. For colors, it's the same thing, right? As designers, we work with hex colors. So we write the keyword color, we put a colon there, and then the hex code for the color, and then a semicolon. That's the way that CSS works. That's it, right? That's all you need to learn for now, right? It might take you a couple times to drill that, but it wouldn't take that long. You probably have already picked it up if you don't know it already. As an aside, so like if you're a developer and I want to mentor a designer, right? Some of you want to get into mentoring, this is a good place to start. Designer, on the next project, you're going to be in charge of just fonts and colors. That's it. Don't worry about anything else in there, but every time you see a font size and you don't like how that looks, you can change it, right? And then send it to me and I will implement it, right? That's a good place to start. Once you've gotten that down, the next level, the next step of that is to learn the web inspector, right? We've seen it in a handful of talks today. The web inspector is really powerful, right? You can do a lot of things in it. So every browser like Chrome or Safari or any of that stuff has a web inspector. Here's me pulling up Wikipedia and opening the web inspector and just messing with it, right? So I've always thought that Wikipedia would look better with the lime green background, which it does, as you would agree. I've also always thought the font size was way too small and that the typeface was not great. So I think Comic Sans is going to be a little bit better, a little bit more legible. And really, let's blow that up because, I mean, let's face it, we're all getting older. And so this is a thing that we're going to need. So there you go. And I always thought that it was a little bit too straight, kind of straight edge for me. So I think one of the things we could do is just flip it, just flip the script. That's a much better way to browse Wikipedia, I think. Right. And so on a more serious note, one of the things that a lot of us, I think, in this room have done to learn CSS way back in the day is open up the web inspector, or back then we didn't have the web inspector, the web developer toolbar, the web developer extension. Anybody remember that or still use that? And just mess with people's sites. Oh, I wonder what happens if I delete this. Oh, OK, the whole site goes away. All right. All right. And that's how we learned CSS. And the web inspector is just kind of a juiced up version of that. So it's really powerful. And you can go to people's sites and mess with their font sizes and colors as a start. Right? So the web inspector is a really powerful tool. Once you get the hang of that, next step, right, dialing it up to the next level, is you can learn JSON. Now, JSON is a really powerful language, but it's also a really simple language, which is probably why it's easy to learn. So JSON kind of works similar to CSS. The JSON syntax is based on a key, right, which you see on the left there. You can make up the key, main color, base font size, accent color. I just made those up. And every key has a value. There's a key value pair. So you have a key like main color, and then you have a value like F46670 or 16 or whatever you want that to be. And that's what a JSON file is. If you look at a JSON file, it's really just keys and values. It gets a little bit more complex, but that's the general idea. And what you can do with JSON is you can actually create configuration files that control things. So to look at this in practice, how do you actually use this in a working environment? Salesforce has a great design system called the Lightning Design System. And in there, they use JSON as one of the formats that you can use to, say, control animation timing. Right? You can say, well, across all of our apps, we want the duration of an animation to be 0.05 seconds or 0.1 seconds, and that's part of it. And you can export all of this stuff to JSON and control the configuration of your app there. So how would you work on this on a project? Well, if you're a designer, you could ask your developer on the next project, dear developer, could you please set this up so that it's driven by a JSON config file? That way, I can work on the visual details separately, and here's the key, and you don't have to worry about it. How many times do we go, the designers, we sit by the hovering art director by a developer's desk? Can you make that 4 pixels? No, 3 pixels. 3.5? No, go back to 3. 3.5? Can you do 3.25? Oh, pixels don't come in fractions? Okay. Right? Like it's just. So this is a compelling argument. You don't have to worry about it. We're not going to do all that hovering art director stuff. I'll go do it at my desk, and we can work together still. It goes the other way around, too, right? As for developers, you can talk to your designers and say, hey, I create a simple JSON config file for you. I know it looks intimidating right now, but all you need is a 1-minute explanation. I'll show it to you, and then you'll get it. That way, you can tweak the details to your heart's content without needing me. And the designer's like, yes, hallelujah. Right? So these are ways that you can get into code a little bit and be working together and kind of have that shared experience. I used to be a design director at an agency in Brooklyn called Big Spaceship. And in Flash's heyday, they did some of the best Flash work around. So this site, they made this site before I started working there, but this site was a part of a campaign for Epson called Epsonality. And on the Epsonality site, you can kind of drag around these series of sliders to see which printer was the best for you, right? So you could say, like, I want it for more for business, and see at the bottom, those printers keep like raising and lowering based on what you select, right? So like, in order to actually get this work, we could have written this really crazy algorithm to control that. But instead of writing this algorithm, we kind of worked on it backwards. So this was the crude CMS that they gave to Epson. And what we did was we said, like, OK, on the right side here, this is the result set. So client, you can just reorder that result set however you want, and then drag the sliders to go, OK, if somebody picks this kind of configuration, this is the result set that we want, something like this. So it's kind of working backwards from the algorithm. It's starting with the result, as opposed to saying, well, this is what the algorithm is, and then let the algorithm figure out the result. It goes the other way around. And then the key is kind of in that bottom right corner there. We got a couple buttons that say things like save XML to server or create XML in the text field and things like that. And XML is kind of a similar configuration format to JSON, so this might as well have been JSON. But it lets the client just play with all this and kind of figure out where they want to dial stuff into. And then when they're ready, they can click the export button and send us the output. And in the meantime, we're working on all the functionality at the same time. Right? So we're just working on stuff. We're like, just keep playing with it until you dial it in. We don't have to wait for that. We can work concurrently. Now, why doesn't this workflow happen more often, right? Where we go, you work on that part, it'll be fine, right? You work on the JSON designer if you want to, fiddle with the colors or the fonts or whatever you want to, and I'm going to go work on some other stuff over here, and then we can just merge our work together and it'll work nicely. Well, I think that doesn't happen because tools haven't evolved much, right? Like, if I told you that this is a screenshot I took yesterday, you'd probably believe me. If I told you this is a screenshot that I took 10 years ago, you'd probably believe me. Right? This is what Photoshop and code editors have looked like for a long time. Right? Both tools are intimidating to the other discipline. If you ask a developer to hop into Photoshop, it's like, well, I don't know. There's a lot of stuff there that I'm not sure what to do with. If you ask a designer to open up an IDE, it's like, well, I'm not sure I know what to do in this place. And that's why I believe tools like Sketch are starting to emerge and gain popularity, is because an engineer can look at Sketch and go, yeah, I think I can make what I need to make in that. And a designer can look at that and go, yeah, I think I can make what I need to make in that. Right? Airbnb, they released their open source library React Sketch. And this kind of flips the whole thing, where you write a React component, and it renders a Sketch document. Right? That's crazy. We haven't seen much of that before, using coding tools to make design files. It effectively lets engineers into the design process, which is awesome. But what about the other way around? What if we use a design tool to make code? Right? What does that look like? And I know some of you are like, wait a minute. Design tools making code, I know what you're up to, mister. I'm not taking that bait. Many of us took the Dreamweaver bait years ago, right, with the promise of design visually and great code automatically, guaranteed. And those dreams were dashed against the rocks. But upon reflection, I think that there's really one thing that Dreamweaver did wrong, right? It was that it tried to do too much. In the mid-2000s, I worked with a company called HappyCog to help start the Philadelphia office. And if I do say so myself, we got pretty good at making websites. Rob over here in the front row worked there as well. Modern browsers at the time supported web standards. Responsive design hadn't really come along quite yet, so we didn't have to tackle those complexities. We all knew the Tontech hack by heart, right? Sorry, this is a little old school reference. Anybody get that one? Everybody's like, get off the stage, oldie. And so what we did was we played games to make it interesting. Right, so as an example, a designer on the team might design a comp. This is not one of the comps that we did, but this is an example of a comp. Has everyone seen a comp before? There's a comp? All right. Wah, wah. And I challenge everybody to a game called CSS First. Right, so normally what you do is you write your HTML first when you get a comp. Right? You see a comp, you write your DOM structure out, and just to make sure you're progressively enhancing appropriately. Right? Your HTML, and then your CSS, and then your JavaScript. That's so boring. So what we started to do was see if everybody could still write semantic code, progressively enhanced code, but from another angle. So I challenged my coworkers to write CSS first without any HTML. So you look at a comp, and you got to write all your classes and your IDs and your CSS before you actually have the HTML. Once you have the CSS done, right, you got to put your CSS away. You can't touch it again. Then you can write your HTML. So you write your HTML, and then you add all your classes, and you get one shot, you link your CSS file in, and then you see how close you got. And the winner got bragging rights for the day. And it's a silly game. It was mostly created to just keep us entertained. But as an industry, aren't we kind of doing that now? Right? Aren't we looking for, well, let me write a CSS file, and it'll have all the things that I need in it. Right? It's the smallest version of that CSS file, but it's going to have a lot. And then it'll let me design everything that I need to do. So for me, I've started to incorporate that mindset into my process and kind of see what that looks like. So let me give you an example of that. Anybody here use an 8-point grid in your designs? All right, if you haven't heard of that, right, it's a fairly simple concept. The idea is basically like you pick a magic number, like 8, and then you use multiples of 8 to define padding, margin, text sizes, all that kind of stuff. You could make a 7-point grid or a 9-point grid or whatever. 8 seems to be sort of a magic number where you get things that aren't too small or too large, but you get variance. So it looks something like this. Here's an 8-point multiples in terms of heading sizes. In between all of those are 80 pixels, right, a multiple of 8. So if I ever see a 100 in my design or a 17, I'll know that I broke my system. And this translates to CSS as well, right? If I ever see 17 in my CSS, I've broken my system. And so you can codify this, right? You can say, well, we have an extra small text size, and that's going to be 8 points, and the margin bottom on that is going to be 16, right? And we have extra small, small, and medium, and large. You can take this a step further, right? You can make this based on variables and kind of have it cascade. You can create a spacing variable and then do multiples of that. Right? And then you can say, you can base your medium text size on, well, this is going to be the large size, and that way if you ever want to change to 9 or 7, it'll cascade all the way through. One more slide of code, and then we'll kind of deviate. You could even take that a step further by creating these mixins. So one of the things that I do is you turn all your options into mixins. You could say, all right, when I make a box, use the extra large margin bottom. Use the medium text size, use the primary color, and position it relative. And that way, you know where you're deviating from your system, right? So on this particular thing, well, I need to nudge this thing 3 pixels up. So I have an area with all of my declarations that lets me do kind of the custom things. And if I see myself adding top 3 pixels more and more times, maybe it's time to fold that into the system. Maybe I make a mix-in with that particular thing. Now, some of you are like, wait, well, we have that already. Right? That's why tools like tachyons and expressive CSS and atomic CSS, they're all catching on, because it's like, write all the styles you'll ever need, and then you don't have to touch CSS anymore. You can just add them. Right? Bootstrap is sort of the same way. But this is where it falls apart. It falls apart where Dreamweaver fell apart, which is that they're trying to do too much. So let's bring this back into our tooling. So let's say we type out a headline in Sketch. Right? And let me zoom into that right panel in the top there. Right? So if we zoom into that, the problem and the great thing about Sketch and tools like it is that I can change this thing in infinite ways. I can change everything about it. The position, the size, the font, the color, the rotation, the angle, everything. I can change everything about it. But what would happen if I made it more finite? Right? So keep an eye on that column. Instead of being able to type anything I want, what if I could only move it in increments of 8? Right? What if I could only say, pick from these 2 typefaces? What if I could only change my paragraph or my leading or my line height or my opacity in defined units? If you could do that, then the software would have to guess less, and you could actually describe the whole document in a configuration file. You can describe the history of the document in a configuration file. And guess what that file could be written in? Yeah, it could be written in JSON. Right? And this is not just a pipe dream. This is not just like, oh, what if we could do this? That would be amazing. As of version 43, right, April of last year, Sketch announced that they moved from their proprietary, their previous binary file format to an open format. It's JSON. So Sketch is built on JSON now. When you save a Sketch file, it saves as JSON. The foundation's already there for us to be working more collaboratively, but we have to do something about that, right? So we've been going about this all wrong. We've been looking for one tool that both designers and developers can use, but that just hasn't served us well, ever. It's OK for designers to be using the tools that they want to use, and for developers to use the tools that they want to use. Right? Nothing wrong with that. But when there's no overlap, that's where things get lost in the chasm in between. So what we should do is look for the overlap between the two. As an example, let's say you use Sketch as a designer, and your developer uses something like Pattern Lab. What's the middle ground between the two? JSON. So if the designer could change just a little bit to create their Sketch files to output the type of JSON that Pattern Lab could ingest, that'd be great. If the developer could tweak their Pattern Lab JSON structure to match what Sketch would output, that'd be great. And nobody's giving that much. It's just a little tweak in process. Maybe the tools could be different too, right? So maybe the designer codes already, use Pattern Lab, and maybe your developer is working in something like Drupal. Well, what's the overlap? Well, JSON and Twig. Both of those read in JSON and Twig. There's a Twig engine for Pattern Lab. Right? So this is where we should be spending most of our efforts, in the overlap here. This is not just design and development, right? So as a great example, there's a plugin for After Effects called Body Movement. If you want to animate in After Effects, you can export that to JSON. Val mentioned it this morning that Airbnb released their tool Lottie, which does the same thing. We don't need complex tools. We just need small, simple ones that focus on the overlap. That'll do the trick. I'm going to go back to the sentiment and we'll wrap up. The smallest set of options that allow us to design just about everything we need. To me, that's what I would call a design system. Right? Design systems are really popular right now, and I don't know that I've heard a good canonical definition, because I think we're all talking about this in our industry, but this feels close to me. Right? Give me all the components that I need to create an interface, but nothing more. I don't want any extra. Right? Give me all of the guidelines I need to create within the system, but don't give me any more. Nothing extra. No wonder design systems are growing in popularity, because they don't just make us work efficiently, although they do, but as humans, I think we crave better ways to work together. Right? In 2001, 17 people met at a ski resort to talk about how to work together better. And what emerged was this thing, the Agile Manifesto. Has anybody read this thing? A few of us. If you haven't read it, it's great. I'm not a software developer, but as I read through it, I'm like, yeah, those are the things I want to adopt in my design process. My favorite one is this one, working software over comprehensive documentation. If you look at the tool, if you look at the output that the people on our projects make, strategists generally make documents, UXers usually make diagrams, designers make comps, developers write code. Which one of these people actually works on software? It's only that one. Only one of them. And where do we spend most of the time on our project? The other three. All the other three are making documentation. If Agile is really a better way, which I believe that it is, and Agile favors working software over comprehensive documentation, why do we have it flipped? Right? Let's find better ways to all be working more directly on the software. Now, you might be a little bit skeptical. After all, I just told you that designers should code and coders should design. Right? Does that mean that everything is now everybody's job? Not really. One of the tools that I like to use is called the Raci Matrix. Has anybody used this? Has anybody seen this at their job? If you haven't seen it, it's great. It's an acronym. It stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And the way that you use it is you make a chart, and across the top, you can write the roles of all the people in the project, like strategist, designer, developer. And along the other axis, you can write all of the tasks that need to be accomplished. Icon style, taxonomy, interface design, QA, whatever it is. And then you just start to map. Who's responsible for what? Who is accountable for what? Who's consulted on a thing? Who is informed about a thing? Right? So you see across the top row, everyone on the project should be responsible for the customer experience. But not everybody's responsible for the icon style. Maybe the designer is responsible for the icon style, the strategist is consulted about it, and the developer is informed about it. Right? Everybody has some level of involvement on a project, but not everybody is responsible for those things. When I'm coaching teams that start out pretty non-collaborative, the Raci Matrix is a lot of R's and I's. Right? These people are responsible, everybody else is informed, and that's it. The more mature a team gets, the more collaborative they get, lots more A's and C's get in there. It's an interesting exercise. If you do this with your team, map it out for a project that you're working on right now, and it'll expose a lot of holes in the collaboration in the way that you're working together. To kind of wrap up, I think that Greg Veen, Typekit's product manager, probably said it best. It all works better when you embrace the idea that product, design, and engineering are just different perspectives on the same thing. Thanks very much.